Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
As we begin to see an increased global focus on the preservation of the environment, today on Invest Africa, we examine state and private sector-led initiatives aimed at greening the continent. Hello and welcome to Invest Africa. I'm Nozi Pombaju. Now, before we begin the discussion, Turning Africa Green is currently being highlighted by the World Eco-Mobility Festival. The CBD of Sandton, where we are, often referred to as Africa's richest square mile, is perhaps right now one of the most congested precincts in Johannesburg. The festival, taking place for the month of October, means workers, residents, visitors can all enjoy a safe, healthy, low-emission and resource-efficient lifestyle. Johannesburg Mayor Park Stow chatted to CNBC Africa about the initiatives that are set to turn the city green.
We are investing in the bus rapid transit system infrastructure in Sandton, but we're also saying to the people that use Sandton that it's about doing both. It's about ensuring that we provide the infrastructure, we provide the buses, we create the alternatives that enable people to look at alternatives that are better than sitting in your car for long hours during the peak hour traffic. So we have to create those alternatives, but we have to incentivize people into those alternatives. So as we're building the infrastructure, this is introducing people into what the future is in Sandton.
And in incentivizing people to use public transport, whether it's the Gau train, which is not necessarily much cheaper than driving to work on a day-to-day basis, how are you going to incentivize people? Are you going to see a congestion charge perhaps coming through like we see in London? Or what mechanisms do you believe are in place to actually incentivize people to use public transport instead of their own means of transport?
Well, for now, we've looked at the supply side. It's about providing buses and alternative infrastructure, including lanes for cycling and walking so that people can have greater access. We're building a bridge over the M1, two bridges, in fact, over the M1 currently under construction, one for a dedicated bus rapid transit system that would go into Sandton and another for walking and cycling. So these are bridges that would ensure that you're able to move from the east to the west of these parts of the city with greater ease, but also integrate Sandton into the overall public transport system of Johannesburg.
You've recently returned from New York for the United Nations General Assembly, where we've been talking about the Sustainable Development Goals, the evolution of the Millennium Development Goals, where the green economy and climate change has played an important role there. I want to talk about the green economy and the opportunities that exist within Johannesburg and Gauteng. What are the opportunities there for corporates and investors looking to invest in this space?
Well, firstly, to say that we should commend corporate South Africa for taking the lead in terms of converting their own buildings into energy-efficient buildings, and now the conversion is moving towards transportation, and that's what we're incubating through the initiatives that we're undertaking. We think that there are an array of opportunities that are available. We will be going out on tender, for example, to look for energy systems, including trying to find in-pipe turbines that use our bulk water pipes to generate electricity. We're looking at technologies about biogas. We're looking into the future of hydrofuel cell technologies, taking advantage of the platinum group of metals. And those are the areas that we're working on, not only as the city, but in partnership with our partners, the CSIR, the University of Johannesburg, and Wits University.
So energy, of course, is a key aspect there, given the constraints that we're seeing in South Africa's economy. Incentives, once again, to bring these renewable independent power producers to South Africa. We've seen the REIPP program a major success, but what has Gauteng perhaps got to offer that can differentiate itself from the rest of the provinces?
Well, as I said, we're emphasizing alternative technologies that would match the current pricing, because one of the important things for us is to introduce a technology that doesn't make it inaccessible for the people of Johannesburg. The cost needs to be better and or comparatively less than what we're currently paying, and that's why we're looking at in-pipe turbines, and we're looking at converting our food waste into energy, and those are projects that we're currently working on together with the Global Environment Facility and the United Nations Environment Programme.
And finally, in getting corporates to reduce waste, in getting the green economy on its feet and incentivizing that, how do you incentivize corporates, the heavy users of energy, whether it's mining industry, whatever the case may be, how do you get them to change their mindset and cut their costs and become more green?
Our emphasis now is on partnerships. It's on building the appropriate partnerships to deal with the challenges. We've been working with the NPI on the green buildings initiatives, but we're also looking at waste management, recycling, and alternative technologies in other areas, but it's about building partnerships with the private sector.
Well, joining us now are Mike Pio. He's the head of infrastructure, energy, and telecoms at Nedbank Corporate and Investment Banking. Jason McNeil, sales director of Interwaste. And in Nairobi, we're joined by Izal Da Silva. He's the director of Strathmore Energy Research Center. Gentlemen, thank you for making the time to join us. Let's start with those of us who are having to live through eco-mobility. How did you get here, Mike? Was it have you found the experience fairly doable and livable?
Lozzie, I cannot tell a lie. I did drive in, but it was only because I was coming in from out of the city. But I think it's creating a great level of awareness. So there are two very important issues. The one is the mobility issue.
Yeah.
Sandton is going to become increasingly congested. That's an absolute fact of life if you look at the development that's going around in the central area. So we need to start looking at alternatives. We can't make the roads any bigger, and we now need to look at alternative forms. The second thing is obviously carbon emissions, the reduction in carbon emissions. And I think the awareness is the important fact. Whether it works perfectly or not is less important. I think you can improve on it all the time, but just getting it into people's minds is the right thing.
And of course, carbon emissions being a bit of a dirty word right now with the VW scandal and all of that, but we'll get to that and much more. Jason, your experience of eco-mobility, has it affected or impacted on you in any way?
Slightly. I had to make alternative arrangements to get into town this morning, so I parked on the outskirts of Sandton and I caught an Uber in. But just to reiterate what Mike's comments were, I think it's very good for awareness. And I think a lot of innovation is born out of necessity. So by taking an initiative like this, I think what we'll see is alternatives come into play and people make alternative arrangements. So I definitely think it is sustainable, and I think it's something that could continue well into the future.
Well, Izal, lucky for you, you're omitted from having to experience eco-mobility with you being in Nairobi. But just give us a sense of what Strathmore does and what is it that this organization is trying to achieve when it comes to raising awareness around green issues in Kenya.
Okay, so I could start by saying that in terms of energy, Kenya is like a baby when compared with South Africa, because you people in South Africa, you have about 30 times more power than we here in Kenya, meaning that a South African will spend in one day the energy that it will take 30 days for an average Kenyan to spend. So, and this means a lot in terms of development, in terms of size of the economy, and even well-being of people in your country. So we are at the beginning of the curve, and my position in this energy sector is research, development, innovation. You know, in order for us to get the energy sector functioning, you have to have three kind of pieces of the jigsaw. One is government. If the government is aware of the importance of energy, if it creates good policy, things move. But if you don't have the private sector also making money, being able to invest and recover their investment and some profit, that doesn't help much. So government alone can do much. But even government and private sector, they don't do much if you don't have the side of the academia, research, development, and capacity building. And so this is my beat. That's what I actually do for a living. I am a Brazilian by birth, but I have been in East Africa for 18 years, first in Uganda and now 5 years in Kenya. And I have been struggling to help Kenyans and Ugandans to be more aware and more knowledgeable about energy, and specifically renewable energy.
Izal, thank you for that. Quite a comprehensive insight into the East African space. Mike, let's start off with you. And I want to take a couple of steps back. And I think Izal has raised a couple of important points around energy and about the investment required for energy. But let's go back to the basics and whether greening the economy actually makes economic sense. Where is that relationship and where does that linkage lie? Okay,
Nozi, so I think to Izal's point, renewable energy, which is the greening part of energy, energy efficiency, for example, all of those concepts make economic sense. You can derive good economic returns from them. So if we exclude any of the conversations around carbon emissions and greening the economy, renewable energy can play a big part of the energy mix. It's not the sole panacea. It's not generally, it doesn't provide you with uninterruptible energy at all times of the day. I mean, the sun doesn't shine at night, but it's part of the mix. And I think there's increasingly an awareness that it needs to be part of the mix. The costs of procuring renewable energy have come down very dramatically over the last few years. And also, smaller scale solutions can really help in rural areas in Africa. In Africa, we face some very unique problems around things like grid connections. We don't have as much connectivity as you might have in Europe. So small solar projects in rural areas make absolute sense.
I think, Mike, again, a couple of really important issues touching on the infrastructure aspects of it and much, much more. I just want to get a comment from Jason. And Jason, the question for you is around who's responsible for leading this initiative? I mean, you're a big player in the waste space. And again, it's an important part of greening the economy and greening the continent. But who should take the lead? Is it the private sector? Is it government? Or should you be doing it together? And is it possible to do it together?
I think it is possible to do it together, and I think we should be doing it together. If you look at some of the policy that government's introduced recently, it's created a framework or created an infrastructure required in order to spur on the development by the private sector. So the Independent Power Producers Program, for example, has allowed independent power producers to come up with initiatives that will generate power and supply it into the electricity grid. A few examples, for example, would be the landfill gas to energy projects in eThekwini, KZN, currently producing 7.5 megawatts worth of power. And the reason that's sustainable is you've got a residual store of energy in terms of the landfill, which is generated through the decomposition of waste, which in turn generates methane, which can be converted into electricity. Had that framework not been in place, we wouldn't have seen that investment being made. So it's definitely a joint effort. And government's very, very interactive when it comes to projects like this. And we've got a number of public-private participation projects on the go as well, which will create further energy capacity.
Well, a couple of issues being touched on in this very short and brief first half. It's around issues of policy and how policy then attracts investment and finding fertile ground so that those investments can yield good returns. Let's take a short break. When we come back, we're going to be going a little bit deeper in some of the issues that the panelists have put on the table. I'll see you in 2 minutes. Welcome back. You're still watching Invest Africa, and still with me in the Johannesburg studio is Mike Pio. He's the head of infrastructure, energy and telecoms at Nedbank Corporate and Investment Banking, as well as Jason McNeil, sales director of Interwaste. And joining us from Nairobi is Izal Silva. He's the director of Strathmore Energy Research Center. Izal, thank you again, and Jason and Mike for coming back and just touching on these issues again. When we went to break, I think we scratched the surface. I want to take a couple of steps back. Mike, I want to come back to the issue of the energy mix and whether you think the ingredients that we've put into this integrated plan make sense in relation to each other, and whether that we have omitted makes sense to be omitted for the energy mix.
So I think in South Africa it makes absolute sense. The scale in which we've been procuring, at the moment we're procuring around 6 gigs of renewable energy with the intention to double that up over the next 4 or 5 years. That's approximately 10% of our total energy mix. And what has happened is that the price, the competitiveness in the process has driven the tariff down to such a good economic level that it makes absolute economic sense.
So it makes economic sense for the consumer, but just picking up on that, Jason, would you say it still makes sense for the investor? Because you always have these issues of what investors are wanting out as returns, and then of course you've got the tariff issues that have to speak to a developmental mandate. Are those two voices finding each other?
They are finding each other, and I think what you've seen happen over the past 4 or 5 years is as electricity price or electricity tariffs have increased, so have the implementation of various alternatives. So you've got the cost of conventional power driving innovation when it comes to the implementation of alternative power. And I know we're going to touch on carbon credits shortly, but those play a vital role in determining whether a project is financially sustainable or not. What you might find is that a project might be on the tipping point, looking for an additional financial incentive to push it over the edge so that that project is implemented. And carbon credits very often play that role.
Izal, let's come to you, Nairobi, for you just to give us a sense of the policy priority that's been given to investing in renewable energy sources from the perspective of the government of Kenya as well as the government of Uganda. Is renewable energy something that is important on the policy agenda?
Yes, definitely. Actually, we are living some kind of historical moment because we have an energy bill which is being enacted right now. It's in Parliament, is meant to come out before the end of this month. And there are very many interesting things in that policy which makes, say, the East Africa region a very attractive destination for investment in renewable energy. For instance, one of the issues mentioned in that energy bill is that 60% of the water that you heat either for commercial or industrial and even residential purpose in Kenya has to be heated by the sun. You cannot heat water, say for the hotel industry, using, say, heavy fuel oil or gas. You have to use the sun. And it makes a lot of sense, and it is now like you have to do that, otherwise you are in the wrong side of the law. Right. Another thing which is very interesting also is the so-called net metering. What is net metering? Is that if you decide to set up some solar panels on top of your roof and you connect it to the grid and you sell that, you send that power during the day when there is a lot of sun to the grid, at night, when you need that power back, you can bring it. You are using the national grid as it were your own battery. So this is a beautiful thing. It sorts out the problem of storage. And of course, the utility will charge a little. You will put 10 units and you can take 7 only. But it is a fantastic idea, and I think is going to make this region a very attractive destination for solar and wind because of these interesting policies.
Izal, thank you for that. Jason, I want to pick up on the carbon credits issue because I think what Izal is also raising is issues of innovation around energy and renewable energy in particular. And I would think that the whole idea of carbon credits is also trying to be innovative and to create the right incentives for compliance and enforcement. Has the idea taken off in the South African context, and is it working if it has?
A few projects have actually taken off in South Africa that are dependent on the carbon credits. The projects I mentioned earlier on in KZN are heavily dependent on gaining the carbon credits, and especially the revenues from those carbon credits. And what they do is they offset it against the capital invested. And if you look at those projects at the moment, they've got an internal rate of return of about 24%. So the carbon credits definitely assist in the investment decision in taking it forward. Again, what will happen now and what we believe will happen going into the future is green energy may attract a premium tariff. And as carbon credit values decrease, and on the agenda is they might even come off altogether. And as electricity prices increase, they might offset what's been lost in terms of the value of carbon credits, which would continue to spur investment into that sector.
So carbon credits, of course, a quick comment from you on that, Mike, because I do want to ask you about carbon emissions broadly. But your sense of carbon credits and what Jason says he sees into the future, almost a premium on green energy is what we should expect.
So I think over the last sort of 5 years, there's really been a significant decline in the ability to utilize carbon credits. The market has evaporated quite largely as a consequence of world powers not being able to agree ways forwards, how to deal with this. So at the end of this year, we have COP21 in Paris. That is the the climate change conference. Hopefully something good comes out of it, because I think the awareness in places like the United States and in China, that awareness is going to drive where the carbon credits come back into being. The Nedbank Group was one of the first green buildings in South Africa, and we were one of the first companies to go completely carbon neutral, and mostly through the use of carbon credits. So a very good, lots of potential, but a lot of innovation needed to get it back in, to incentivize people to be able to participate in carbon credits.
And just a broad insight, Mike, around carbon emissions. I mean, I think the VW scandal has been the headlines for quite the wrong reasons for quite a number of weeks. But one walks away with the sense that the private sector is always looking for ways to cheat the system, and that it's not always about compliance and doing things the right way. What do you take away from this experience? So
I think the legislation, people will, I'm not sure how folks can get themselves into that type of a situation, but on things like carbon credits, it's very difficult to cheat the system. It's a very auditable sort of process as to where you've started and where you've ended up in terms of emissions, etc. So I don't think it gets abused as much as we believe it gets abused. I'm going to come back to Jason in a second just to talk about compliance enforcement around the waste industry and especially around the manufacturing players in South Africa. But before we do that, let's go back to Zal in Nairobi. Zal, Mike makes mention of COP21, which is expected to take place in Paris. South Africa hosts, I think it was COP17. And so at a very high level, you have these platforms of dialogue and a lot of spotlight on the policy issues that should be supporting the agenda to green the continent. Your insights, are these working? Is this just a talk shop, or are there tangible results coming out of it? Okay, what I have to tell you is that with renewable energy, we have reached the so-called grid parity. And this concept is very interesting. It means that you yourself could eventually begin producing electricity for your household, and you would pay less than the amount that the utility is charging you for that same kilowatt hour. So this is eventually what makes sense. You know, we have a problem in East Africa, at least because we have seen very few solar systems and solar production farms. And the problem is not that we don't have sun. We have actually the sun every day of the year. But the problem we have is lack of capital. For instance, I am not very conversant with the South Africa reality, but here in Kenya, if you go to the bank to ask for a mortgage to get a loan to install a home system, a solar home system, or some wind turbine, you will be making the wrong decision, because your internal rate of return in that renewable energy will not be able to cater for the interest rate that the bank will charge you. So my university is called Strathmore University, is proudly the first zero carbon footprint university in the whole of Sub-Saharan Africa. I'm not aware that of anyone in South Africa, for instance, any university in South Africa, which is zero carbon footprint like the one we have. We have 0.6 megawatt of installed capacity in our roofs, and we use it for training engineers and technicians in here, in our center, and also, most important than that, we use it to create awareness amongst our students. I have lawyers, I have IT people, I have actuarials, I have people who do finance, I have people doing, say, tourism and hospitality. All these kids, I want them to be exposed to renewable energy, such that in 4 years when they graduate, they will all be green lawyers, green IT, green actuarial, and so forth. So why did I do that? Because I got money in a cheaper manner. The government of France gave me a loan at 4% per year in dollar, and gave me 10 years to pay back that loan. I'm making sense. The money I'm saving from my electricity bill is servicing my loan, and in 5 years' time I will be done with payments, and I'll have 25 years of free
energy.
Izal,
so this is what makes it.
Izal, I look forward to seeing green lawyers. I think that's certainly one concept I haven't heard of in a while. But before we get to a wrap, I quickly want to come back to you, Jason, because I think we haven't spent any time on the waste industry, and one would really want to get a deeper understanding around the level of compliance to waste management when it comes to private sector players. How would you describe that right now?
I think at the moment compliance really is being led by blue chip corporates. If you look at South Africa's legislation, that legislative environment, we have a very progressive system when it comes to waste management. In terms of enforcing that compliance, resources become an issue, but that batton's definitely been picked up by corporate South Africa, who are looking at implementing systems not only to reduce their environmental footprint, but they're looking at the long-term benefits within their business as well. So by implementing these systems in order to meet the new compliance regulations, what we're finding is that a lot of our customers are reducing not only the cost of managing their waste, but they're also reducing raw material inputs, as well as reducing their environmental footprint. So compliance is a very, very key issue, definitely being led by corporate South Africa.
Being led by corporate South Africa, that is compliance around the waste management sector. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. We've barely touched the surface of many of these important issues. I think this calls for a second round for us to really look at this very broad agenda of greening the continent. A very big thank you to Mike Pio. He's the Head of Infrastructure, Energy and Telecoms at Nedbank Corporate and Investment Banking. Jason McNeil, Sales Director of Interwaste. And in Nairobi, we're joined by Izal De Silva, Director at Strathmore Energy Research Center in Nairobi. And he has a dream, of course, of also in the next 4 to 5 years producing green lawyers. I'm going to be looking out for that. And for you at home, if you'd like to take part in this conversation, you can certainly do that. That's just by dropping us a tweet. Use the hashtag #InvestAfrica. Follow us at CNBC Africa and myself at The Real Nosy. From myself and the Invest Africa team, it's goodbye.